So we're now going to take a look at forms, which are a fundamental part of the web because we often need to submit data through to a server. Now obviously we're not looking at things in terms of a server because that basically requires a whole other knowledge of servers, and if you were to use a back-end language like PHP to do this. But what we are going to look at is how data is transferred to a server, and then from there on you can continue your journey just to learn about how to pick that up on the server. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at styling a basic form. We'll start with a very basic example, then we'll add some more complicated examples on top of it. So let's do this now. Now, to start off a form, you need to look more at the markup than you do at the styling. So we'll look at all of the markup, then we will inspect the markup and see how it sits on the page, and then we'll start to style it so we can make this look really nice. So by default, inputs are at a inline level, or an inline block level, I can't quite remember, but we'll find out in just a moment. So let's start by defining our form. Our basic form element looks like this. So it's just an opening form and a closing form. So inside here will sit all of the elements, the different input types, the different, you can have a submit button, you can have checkboxes, you can have text areas, etc., etc. And we'll look at an example of all of these. And then we'll talk a little bit about more about HTML5 input types, which are really useful. So form can contain, there's a few attributes, but we'll just focus on a couple. One is the action. Now this is the page that the form is submitted through to. So if, for example, we had /sign up and we wanted to add a few fields in here that you would ask from a user. So perhaps you would ask their email address, their proposed username and their password, maybe twice. And then you would have maybe a checkbox to say, do you want to sign up for my newsletter or this newsletter? And then you would have a submit button to submit the form. We've all seen this when we browse the web. The next thing we have is a method. Now this is get or post. Now get will send the data within your form through via a query string on the end of a URL. Whereas if you choose a method of post, this will send it via the HTTP request in the body of the HTTP request. Don't worry if that doesn't make sense too much just at the moment. You can play around with the method and see how this works, and we can use that. We can do that with Chrome Developer Tools. So let's start by containing each input in some kind of element. And to do that, really the best element to use is a div because it's a generic container. So I'm going to create a div here with a class of, let's say, form field. Okay, just to keep things descriptive. So in here now we're going to create our first input element. We've already touched on this throughout the series, but we'll be styling this form up and creating it a little bit nicer. So we have an input. Now an input is a self-closing element. You sometimes see it like this, but I tend to not close elements like that. I just think it looks a little bit neater. So we have an input. We have a type. Now the type is basically, as it sounds, the type of data that you're using. However, previous to new input types from HTML5, you would find that even for numbers, you would use a type of text. This is the most common input type. So an input type of text will just give you a box that looks like the following. So let's refresh the page like that. So you can just go ahead and just type in anything you want in there. Okay, so we've got an input type of text, but when we submit this form, there's no way of knowing what this input is called. There's no way to identify this. So we have another attribute called name, which identifies this particular field. So for example, say inside of this form field we had a label. This is another HTML element which basically gives us a label for a specific field. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to wrap this like so. And then in here I'm going to say email address. And in the name I'm going to call this email. So that's how I'm going to pick that up. So let's look at how this has changed. Okay, it's not looking great. It looks a bit bland, but we'll sort that out soon. So we've now got a label. The reason I've done this label, and there's a couple of ways we can do this. We can get rid of this and do it another way. I could say here, label, and I can end that label element. And then in here, I could say for, and then give a name. So I could say for email. And what this means, find me an ID of email, an ID of email, and then apply it when I click it or do something like that. It's basically semantically correct because you're technically tying a label down, like so, email address, to a particular form field. So what's going to happen now is when I click on email address, label for, that should be ID equals email, not for email. So when I click on email address, you see when I click on that, it focuses on our actual form itself. Brilliant. But I prefer this solution where you wrap it. It just means that you don't have to give each of your form fields an ID. In my opinion, it just makes it a little bit cleaner. So I can still click this and it still works in the same way. It's particularly useful for people on smaller viewports or just any viewport where you have a touch screen only. It just means that the user can just click and they're more likely to focus on that form field. So let's go into a little bit more of the theory about actually how you submit forms. And we'll do this by creating down here a submit button. So we can do this a couple of ways. We can do input type of submit. We can give that a name, but there's not usually any reason why you would give it a name. And we have a value. So for example, sign up. Value will be what's shown on the input type by default. Be careful because if you don't supply this, it will give you submit, which may seem okay, but in browsers like I think Internet Explorer will come up with submit query. So you'd better off defining your value. So now we've got an email address, we can actually submit this through. Now what it's going to do is it's going to go through to sign up, which doesn't exist at the moment, and it's using the get method. So let's see what happens here. I'm going to type in my email address and I'm going to go ahead and hit sign up. Okay, so it's gone through to this sign up page, which obviously doesn't exist. And the reason it's gone through to just file / is because I had a prepending / like that. We could just get rid of that and then enter my email address and hit sign up and it would go through to here. So it's now got email in there equals alex@phpacademy.org. So, for example, if I was to change this to post, and I'm actually going to change this to index.html just because it's a little bit easier for us. If I was to type alex@codecourse.com and hit sign up, it doesn't look like anything's happened. But let's bring up our element inspector and hit the network tab. And let's give this a refresh. And let's go ahead and type alex@codecourse.com, hit sign up. Now what's happened is, you can see here, instead of the method being get, which is what happens when we just land on the page, it says input type a method of post. So when I click on this and look at the headers, you can see the request payload has the email address in it. And this is what we use to pick this up on the server side. So we're not going to go too much into this at all because it's irrelevant to what we're doing, but that's generally how it works. Okay, so we've got an input type of email address, but we could do better. I'm going to do an input type of email. This is a new HTML5 input type, and this does a couple of things. One, it semantically tells us what this field is expecting. So for example, if you were to view this website that we've built here on your phone, you'd notice that your keypad would change to give you more appropriate options for entering an email address. Obviously on a desktop it doesn't really matter because you have your keyboard and that's it. Your keyboard on your desktop physically doesn't change when you click these different fields, but on a smaller device with an on-screen keyboard, or even a bigger device with an on-screen keyboard, it'll give you specific keys like an @ symbol or a .com, and that'll allow you to enter your email address a lot quicker. So go ahead and try it on your phone with an input type of email compared to an input type of text. A really good idea is to copy this, paste it down here, and to change this to text, and then either put this on Dropbox or something like that, or put it on hosting if you have hosting, and then check the difference between doing this on your phone, and you'll see different keys appear on your on-screen keyboard. That's one benefit. The second benefit is that we have some kind of front-end validation going on here. So if I was to type in just A and hit sign up, you can see that this automatically pops up. Please include an @ in the email address. A is missing an @. So you can see that we get this validation on here, and this is really useful because it means that we don't have to rely on front-end validation. Now, a really good point here is that you still need to depend on server-side validation. Don't think that if you are going to learn a server-side language that because you have front-end validation like this, let's just get rid of that and check it again, that you don't rely on server-side validation. The reason being is that if I was to say alex@codecourse and not included.com, this is really it's not an invalid email address, but it's unlikely to be my email address. When I hit sign up, that actually works, whereas if I type A, that doesn't work. So the front-end checking here isn't brilliant, and it's also not supported across all browsers. Now you might be thinking, well, if this isn't supported across all browsers, what's going to be shown to the user? Well, as a matter of fact, if an input type of email isn't supported by any browser, it will fall back automatically to a text type because it doesn't recognize the type. It's the same concept as if we were to type input type of cat. When I refresh, we get exactly the same as what we'd normally expect. And then when we go ahead and enter alex@codecourse.com and hit sign up, we click on index.html and we get the same data sent through, alex@codecourse.com. So that's it pretty much. We've got our text there, our input type of email that falls back. We know how to name these things. We can give these classes IDs if we wanted to style them, but we're going to be looking at a better way of styling this form. So let's move on to doing something like an username. So we do the same thing. We wrap we wrap this element in a form field class, which we're going to be styling later. We'll create our label here. So remember, this label wraps this. The label text is choose a username, and the input here is a type of text, name, email. Name, username. So we can do exactly the same thing again. So a div with a class of form field. Inside we have our label. We open and close that element. Down here we have the choose a password. We won't do choose password again because it's unnecessary. This time we're going to choose a different type, and this type is going to be password. And the name of this is going to be password. Now the reason we choose a type of password is when we click in here and start typing something, you see that our browser actually blanks this out, just in case anyone's looking over our shoulder. So with the username, it's a text type, so this doesn't matter. With the email address, it doesn't really matter. The password is secure from people looking. So what we're going to do now, before we go any further, is actually take a look at styling this up. Just before we do sort of go any further, let's take a look at different input types that we actually have available to us. So I'm going to use this one as an example. Input type of number. Now bear in mind these don't render the same on all browsers, so it's really difficult to sort of judge the support for these. You can see that the input type of number actually gives us these buttons that we can click up and down with, and we also then have additional attributes like max. So I can set the max to 5, and I could set the min to 2, for example, and I could set the step to 1. This is basically what the increment is when you increment up and down. So it starts at 2 there, I can't go any further, and it ends at 5, I can't go any higher. So that's an input type of number. We've also got really abstract things that you might not use in everyday application, like input type of color. This is actually a color picker that allows us to grab our native color picker and choose a particular color, and then when we submit this through, it will submit the hex value for the color. So there's some really cool things that you can do, but I would suggest you go and have a look at some HTML5 inputs, how they're supported. That's really, really important, and how you can actually use them in your application. Remember, you do get that front-end validation, so it's really, really cool. So let's go ahead and style this form up because we want to learn about CSS. So really we want to be able to style this form up so it looks half decent. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring in a little container. I'm just going to assume that this is placed into a container with a fixed width. We won't look at responsive just now. In fact, we can, to be honest. So let's end that div there and indent that. So over in our style sheet, let's go ahead and say container. And let's set a width of this of 100% and a maximum width of, let's say, 500 pixels. So let's inspect this. So our container now is about that big. That looks okay to me. Okay, so what we want to do now is we want to perhaps style these form fields. Now at the moment these are just divs, so they're block level elements. If I didn't have these in here, what would actually happen if we just get rid of them temporarily? Oops. If I didn't have them in here, you can see that these elements all sit next to each other, or as far as they can go. The container's making this one drop down, but they would show in one long line. And that's because inputs, if we just have a look here in the computed styles, have a display of inline block. We can style them like a block element, but they are sat in line. So by wrapping these around them, we have more control over how we can style them. They're automatically put onto a new line like so. Even if our style sheet can't be rendered or downloaded or whatever, then this still looks at least presentable for a user to go ahead and submit. Okay, so inside of main.css then, let's tackle this issue of our styling. We'll look at very basic styling here. So we're going to say form field, and in fact we don't really need to do this, to be honest, but yeah, we'll get rid of this. We'll say input. Now what we can do, and what a lot of CSS frameworks do, is they say input type of text, input type of password, and then they style them. What I'm going to do just as a shortcut is I'm going to say input, and I'm going to say I want this to be a display of block. You can already guess what that's going to do because it's a display of block. Remember, block elements take up the entire width of their parent container, which in our case is a 500 pixel wide container. So there, now we've got these like this. Now the reason they're not shown as full width, if we just hover over one of them, is because we have a fixed width to these basically. If we just check down here, you should see it. We've got a height there and a width of 117 pixels by default. What we want to do is we want to say width of 100%. Now we've got a problem here because this sign up button is also an input. So as well as these going wider, the sign up button also does this. So what we could either do is use a not selector, which would probably be not the best idea, but we can now, because this cascades down, we can say an input type of submit width auto, and that will just set back to its auto width. Okay, so that's reset that. So now I think, in a world where we're using mobile devices, these inputs should be a little bit bigger because at the moment it's extremely difficult to see. If I type Alex at codecourse.com in there, it just looks a little bit small and I can't see much. And one of the reasons for this is that the input text is a lot smaller than the actual text on the outside. So we can remedy this by setting this whenever or wherever we set our font. So for example, font 1M, I'll just say Arial for now and a sans serif backup, but you might want to change this. So we can say body, input, text area. We'll look at text areas in just a moment. And there we go. So we've got the same font now for each one. So inside of here then, for the input, let's do a padding of say 10 pixels. There we go. That looks quite cool. And for this submit here, you can see if we head over to styles, the padding isn't being affected for the submit button. And I think if we were to add a border of 0, you can see that then does take into effect. So I think this is either, I'm not sure whether it's a bug or not, but it's just one of them things, I guess. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to style this submit button to look like a sort of nice little button. So all I want to do is say input type of submit, border, 1 pixel, solid, CCC. I'm going to say background color, hash EEE or DDD maybe. There we go. So we've got a little button there. Okay. So what we want to do now is I want within every one of these fields, I want the input, or within every one of these form fields, I want there to be a margin on the bottom. So down here we say form field margin bottom 20 pixels. And there we go. That just, oops, that should space everything out. Let's just take a look what's happened. Form field, like so. And there we go. So that's already a little bit nicely spaced out. So now for the labels, what I want to actually happen is for any label within a form field, I want the label to have in actual fact, could we? Yeah, we could say label margin bottom, I think. But I tell you what, let's leave that because it's a little bit confusing. Anyway, the form now, if we just pull this in, will respond. I think. Okay, so the reason this is happening is because we have padding set on these inputs, and obviously we know that padding affects the box model. It's going to affect the width of these elements. So that's a little bit of a problem there. So we can either combat this by saying that we want the padding to be, I don't know, say we want the width to be 100% and we want the padding to be 5%, and we chop this down to 90%. We could do that if we wanted to. Probably not a good idea, to be honest. Or we can say box sizing border box, like so. But again, the benefit of using a front-end framework, as we've already seen, is that it already comes with form stuff available. So this is a very basic example. Let's look at something a little more different now. Let's look at a text area. So let's paste this down here just to save a little bit of time. And let's say about you. So a text area is not a self-closing element. It starts with text area and it ends with text area. And you can style these as normal with CSS. We're just going to give this a name. We're just going to say bio, for example. And that's it. We don't need to give it a type because the type is already denoted by the fact it's a text area element. So now we have this. It looks a little bit annoying because it's sat next to that element there and it just doesn't look great. And that's because we've only applied this to input. We've not applied that to text area as well. Text area, really, you'd treat it like an input field. So here you can see the user can drag this. We can set a max width of 100 on here to combat that. So we could say max width 100% as well as 100% width, like so, and that will not allow it to be pulled along this way. And we could set the height, but we don't want to do this, and I'll show you why. If I type line 1, line 2, this text area has a perfect height for 2 lines here. Let's say I came along and I said, right, well, I want all text areas to be a height of, I don't know, 1 or 2, 300 pixels, let's say. So 300 pixels, you don't know that this is enough to fit in lines. So let's just say I am a line, and let's just copy and paste this down and down and down, again and again and again. Right, so it gets to the point where the last one is now touching the bottom of the element, and that's because we're using pixel heights. We're going to scrap that all together, but instead we're going to specifically define every time we create a text area that we want rows of a certain amount. So a rows of 2, you can imagine, is enough for 1 line, 2 lines, like so. If we were to say we want a row of 4, that's increase the height of the element, row, 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 and row, and there we go. It's a perfect fit. So that's a little bit neater than using a width. You can use using a height. You can use a height, but it's going to affect things. Okay, so let's move on then to look at a checkbox. So we're going to create a div class again of form field, and then inside here we have an input type of checkbox. So it's the same as an input type of password, text, whatever. And then we're going to, we could wrap this in a label, but it's probably better instead to have a label just here, like so, and then say, sign me up to the newsletter. And then in here, say 4 equals newsletter. And let's give this element a name of newsletter. And let's give this an ID of newsletter as well. So let's take a look at that. And there we go. So it already looks a little bit odd. And that's because if we inspect this, and you can see that we can check this now, which is quite cool. Check that. The checkbox is an input. And obviously we set input to display of block. So we can come into our style sheet, and down here we can say input type of checkbox. We can say display auto. Oh no, sorry, not display auto. We can say display inline block, like so. Oh no, it'll be inline. Like that. If we take a look. Of course, we've got the width on there as well. So let's say display inline block and width of auto. And that should sort it out, because we can have it as an inline block. Okay, cool. So that's worked. The only problem now I see is that we have included, I think, there we go. I think I ended that form. It should be a div. So you can see here that in Chrome Web Developer Tools, I'm starting a form field here, and it's actually ending as a div, but I actually ended this as a form. It's auto-corrected, so sometimes this can be a little bit misleading. I just did a typo there and wrote form there, and in actual fact, it should have been an end of a div, and that's why we don't get the spacing that we expect here. So when I refresh now, we get the spacing back. So now I can click on this text to actually check the elements. That's why the form is really, really important. The label here is really important. You can imagine how annoying it would be if you're on a smaller device and you wanted to check this, you had to actually check this tiny little box here. Now, unfortunately, it's really difficult to style things like checkboxes and radio buttons. There are JavaScript libraries available to do that, but we're not going to be delving into that too much right now. So we've now created a form. We've styled it up. You can imagine that you can go ahead and play around with this. It responds down quite nicely, but if you are deciding you want to go down the route of using a CSS framework, which is generally a good idea, the markup is going to be a lot better than the markup I've just written, and the styles are probably going to be a lot better than the styles I've written as well. So you might want to take a look at using things like Foundation or Bootstrap to mark up your forms.